Hello, everyone. I'm Jasmine Simpkins, TV host, reporter, and film critic, member of AAFCA. Today, I am so thrilled to be here to moderate this very special discussion on the making of Lawmen Bass Reeves. I'd like to introduce our panelists, series lead and executive producer and recent Critics' Choice Award nominee for his portrayal of Bass Reeves, David Oyelowo, and Lauren Ebank, who plays the one and only Jenny Reeves. Hello, hello, hello.
Hi. Hi, Jasmine. Thanks for having us.
Oh my gosh, I wouldn't have it any other way. First of all,
you a lawman or an outlaw?
Bit of both, I reckon.
I need a man with a good gun and a straight spine. You up for the task?
I wouldn't be sitting here my Sunday best if it wasn't.
Around these parts, we might be men. They're just killers. All thieves.
I took an oath to protect everyone. I ain't about to quit this.
You find a home for yourself, what would you do to hold on to it, to protect it?
You got to the count of 5 to get the hell off my land.
Lady, you got 2 shells in that bird killer.
Then I just shoot you twice, just to be certain.
How do I get to do what you do?
You're loyal, and you ain't afraid of much. But the real power lies beneath the badge. Ready to ride?
I thought you'd never ask.
I'm warning you. Your wicked days are done.
this question is for both of you, but I will start with you, David. Did you know about Bass Reeves? Because it certainly wasn't in my textbooks when I was in school, K through 12. Don't remember it.
No, you don't remember it because it wasn't in there. And that's the tragedy, that's the injustice, that's the thing that when I was introduced to him in 2014, I just didn't get it. There is no way, if this guy was white, that he wouldn't be on a $5 bill or something. I mean, it's just like extraordinary what he did, when he did it, how he did it, who he was. And in the midst of this beloved genre, since the inception of cinema, one of the first images we ever saw in cinema was a black man on a horse. Why has this guy's story not been told? We know why. But, you know, when I, as I say, was introduced to him and this story about 7-8 years ago, that's where the obsession began, and it was just red rag to a bull. I just I would not rest until that injustice was corrected, and so yeah, that's the journey that led me to him and to where we are now.
All right, and Lauren, you play Jenny, who I was fascinated by also, and was very much happy that we were able to see her story, right? I feel like behind every great man, and I know David can agree because he has a beautiful wife, is a strong and capable woman holding it down. So how much joy did you have in playing her, and had you even heard about her story and or Bass's?
You know, it was to your point that you just made about how strong and beautiful and powerful she was. I couldn't believe I didn't know anything about her. I knew about Bass Reeves. I had an uncle who loves Bass Reeves because he's a historian at heart of Westerns. And so he collects information and just the West in general, not just the fictional accounts, but the West as it was. And so he loves Bass Reeves, and he always would talk about him. And he said, as a kid, I was always curious. I think a Western he was watching mentioned Bass Reeves. Okay, like, and this is my uncle who is 80, and he said, somebody said, yeah, we almost got out of there. I think it was whoever it was, the big cowboy at that time, but of course he was a white male. And he said, we almost got out of there. And then Bass came. And he said, who is Bass? He said, as a kid. And he researched and found that Bass was a Black cowboy. And then he had no idea, I think in little town, Edenton, North Carolina, that there was a such thing as a Black cowboy. Yeah. But he had never seen Bass Reeves on screen. So when I got this script and I found out that Bass Reeves was going to happen. And then I saw Jenny Reeves, who I didn't know that Bass was partnered to a woman and that they had 10 kids and, you know, thrived as a family. I was really happy about the opportunity to bring Bass's story, Jenny's story to the screen because of the lack of representation that my uncle didn't have back in the, I don't know what year he was born, but he's 80, right? You know what I mean? So yeah. What he didn't have, also to be able to say, and this is who Jenny Reeves was, the woman that stood beside him, and also the woman, and I think represented a whole generation, the whole fabric of America that made Reconstruction so beautiful and so powerful. But when I saw Jenny on the script, I saw a woman who was empowered, or was empowering Bass to go do his thing, which you'll see in our show. And I saw someone who was loving, and I saw someone who was protected. But the beautiful thing is that she was also, you know, protected, loved, and empowered herself. So I was really happy about that. Yeah.
Well, obviously this story is biographical, but it's also a Western, right? So when I think of a Western and I watch a Western, I need folks on the screen to be doing a couple of things: riding a horse, have a shotgun, right? And have a certain accent or dialogue. Of those three things, what was the most challenging for you guys? The horse riding, the shooting, or getting that, you know, that particular draw to play these characters?
Yeah, I mean, they were all, of course, as you can imagine, difficult in their own way. I mean, I spent over a year horse riding in preparation for this, knowing that, you know, one of the ways to sell the fact that I am Bass Reeves, so to speak, which is what you're trying to, you know, to a certain extent convince the audience of. You have to get that right. You don't want to be cutting to a stuntman and everything's on my back, you know, because I think that's how you get the authenticity. The voice, the accent, of course, tricky because, you know, our show plays out in the 1860s and 1870s. And, you know, it's different to the way people talk now. It's closer to when Africans were brought to this country through enslavement, and you don't have the globalization we have in terms of all of our accents have become a kind of a mishmash because of social media and television. You know, people were not moving that far from where they were, and so all of that means that you really have to pay homage to the authenticity of what that was. Lauren and I had the privilege of working with the amazing Denise Woods, who is our dialect coach and who helped us with that, but also through recordings of enslaved people who were still, you know, alive around about the late 1800s, 1900s, who there were recordings of. We used those as well. And then the shoot 'em up stuff, of course, you know, the great thing about that Taylor Sheridan outfit is between Yellowstone 1923, 1883, they have that dialed in. But it's so interesting you say that, because for me, the challenge of this show was how do we tick all of those boxes, as you say, of the Western, but manage to make it expansive enough that even people who don't like Westerns are going to gravitate towards this. And
who doesn't like a Western?
Well, quite a few people actually. You know, it's a beloved genre, obviously, but there are people who are like, nah, that's not my thing. That's not, you know, and for this story, I was just very keen, and thankfully Chad Feehan, our showrunner and co-creator, we felt like the way to frame this while ticking those boxes is around a family. You know, we can all relate to family. We can all relate to the work-life balance being a tricky thing. And if you have this man and woman who really love each other, really love their kids, and the challenges of the time and the challenges of his profession keep them apart, the tension in the show is them always trying to get back to each other. And that's something anyone and everyone can relate to. So we tick the boxes and try and color outside the lines of it.
Yeah. Lauren, how about you? And you also tickle the ivories as well. So she's such a multifaceted woman. I love it.
She is. I mean, there's not much to do, you know, in 1870 something in the West. I found that people, you know, instrumentation and writing and poetry were, you know, big forms of entertainment for themselves. Luckily, my last show, City on a Hill, I learned to play the piano on that show. And so here we were a few months later doing this one. So I had a basis of understanding, but a totally different genre of music. So that was a lot of fun. Thankfully I had a coach to jump in with right away and learn more. The weapons training, we had cowboy camp, like, you know, Jenny, the mode of transportation was horses, whether it was a horse and carriage or horseback. So we knew right away that it was important to be able to also have me at cowboy camp. So I was holding down for the women in cowboy camp. And I learned to drive a wagon. I learned to just control a team of mules and really make them my family, because I think when you're on the farm, the livestock is a part of the family. So I spent a lot of time just on the land and a lot of quiet time with the animals. And then I also learned to horseback ride as well, and rodeo and rope and move cattle, which was a lot of fun and also just wild and crazy to be jumping in so fast and furious as the wranglers on the Bosque Ranch have us doing. And then, you know, what was the other? Oh, the dialect. So I'm from North Carolina and I have a Southern dialect, but anyone from the South knows that means 500 different things. And it was really important for me to get the nuances of the Texas dialect in the late 1800s right. And that's very, very different. It's not a modern approach. It's not Texas in 2023. You're talking about people who had no access to education. And in fact, it was punishable by death to learn to read. They learned in a different way. They learned language in a different way. And so I had to wrap my mouth around what that looked like, wrap my imagination around how that sounded and how that resonated from the body. Because it is, I think they still relied a lot, you know, very similar to other cultures, indigenous cultures relied on the body to express more than what the language expressed. So, you know, I learned a lot of that. And then Denise, who is so fantastic. I just hope anybody, you know, after this wants to work with Denise Woods, because I was really trepidatious about whether I was nailing that dialect or the vocal placement of the dialect, because Jenny talks, you know, much lower than I talk. And so I reached out to her in the beginning. I said, hey, I don't know if you saw my audition tape, but here's what I've done so far. And she said, oh, baby, you're fine. She asked me like a series of questions about how I connected with spirit. And that was her indicator of whether I'd be able to handle the dialect through the rest of the piece, because so much of it is about how much you allow for these people to come through you. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. David, the series jumps, right? We jumped some years, so definitely that means that, you know, your character is definitely going to have some hair and some makeup changes, costume changes. How much did you work with those different departments to really kind of evolve Bass through the series?
Enormously, and they were crucial. Vonda K. Morris, who is our head of makeup, and Wankia as well, who did amazing work with the hair, and Isis Mussenden, who was our costume designer. You know, we worked with them to help chart that, because it's 15 years that the show charts. At the beginning of it, I'm in my sort of mid-20s, and then by the end, late 30s. So there is a hair component, there's a makeup component, there's a, as Lauren said, placement of the voice component, what's happening in the body. So working with my trainer as well on just what that looks like, what that feels like. And it was truly a group communal effort to get there. The crazy thing was that, as most people will know, you're shooting things out of order. So there would be days where I'm shooting episode 1, where I'm 25 or whatever, and then episode 8, where I'm 39, and he has been a farmer. He has been through enslavement. He's now been a deputy U.S. Marshal for a few years. That's an entirely different disposition in that person, both voice, body, experience, sense of self. And so you need a lot of people keeping an eye on a lot of things to make that convincing, because the audience, when they're watching it, they don't care. They're just like, oh, I'm in episode 8, I'm in episode 1. They're not going, oh, we'll give them a pass that the hair looks a bit funky there, So, that was very much a communal effort and something to really, really focus on. And I give credit to our directors as well, Christina Voros and Damian Marcano, just to really help with charting, because you see it with mine and Lauren's character. We're kind of kids at the beginning of the show, and by the end we have, I think, 5 kids, and we have been through the mill, and that's a very different thing. But there were days we would shoot both things in the same day, and so that requires a real group effort.
I love that. Well, let's dig a little into that, because we definitely see this relationship kind of pull apart, right? And you talked about that, David, that obviously the core of this is this family and this love story, but it definitely has its, bumps. So, Lauren, I'm curious, how is David as a scene partner playing your husband? And talk about too, just that, how you guys are growing apart. You're essentially doing your own thing at one point, right? And he's off, bringing home the bacon, but is far away for long periods of time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Very long periods of time. And we had a very early conversation, David and I, about Jenny and Bass and their love and their faith. And I think the faith is probably the biggest component, especially, again, for newly emancipated Africans in America. Like the faith that you have to have about whether you're going to see your family member again, whether you're on the plantation and they get separated and sold for you, or after, just because of the energy and, unfortunately, the domestic terrorism that existed at that time as it related to the forward progression of African Americans. That faith has to be so connected to each other so that you feel close to each other even when you're away. And it was something that we really invested in. Not to mention, when they come together, you want to feel the celebration, the relief, the joy of those two people still being able to find each other again, whether it's the first time they found each other again in episode 1 or after very long stints on the road. I think, Jenny that was one of the things I really loved about Jenny, is that she wasn't just this all the way together, fully developed woman with nothing to learn about life and nowhere to go. She still had a lot to learn. And I think the viewers will see, because I know we'll be able to share this after the finale, but there's, she takes a journey where the idea of doing for people outside of her household doesn't seem necessary. She has enough to worry about with the 5 kids that she has and the growing family that they have. So when the proposal comes about a Black township and the things that we need to be invested in and the things we need to fight for, just on the heels of what we just came from, which was slavery, I think there was something for Jenny to learn about how she can contribute to the world and society. And so she and Esme go off, and they do a lot of things. And I was very, very invested in that part of it.
Speaking of wives, David, your beautiful wife, Jessica, is in the series. Talk about, her casting and her character and getting to work with her on screen.
Yeah, I mean, she produced this along with me through our company, and she's been there for a lot of those 8 years that I was talking about, of trying to get this thing made. And she came in to play the role of of our enslaver, which is super weird. I mean, crazy. Rachel Reeves, and you know, people will see in the first episode this scene that was extremely uncomfortable to play. You know, it was a devastatingly dangerous thing to be in proximity of a white woman at that time in close quarters when anything could be said of what that interaction was. And so it was kind of cathartic and weird and sort of just really interesting to play that with a woman I've been married to for 25 years and have 4 kids with, and to feel the dynamic of what us plus that time and place might have been. Really shows you how crazy racism is. Yeah. The fact that these things imposed upon us by prejudice and truly, in my opinion, a demonic mindset, how they position us against each other. But yeah, and Jess's character, you know, there's a very powerful scene between both Jess and Lauren later on in the show as well. One of my favorite, actually, in the entire show. They're both magnificent in that episode and in that scene, and it kind of crystallizes so much of the injustice of that time, the mindset of that time, the seed of Jim Crow that comes after this period of Reconstruction. Because to Lauren's point, this was a moment in time that I'm so shocked we haven't seen more of, depicted both in film and television, because it was a time where a family like the Reeveses could have this future steeped in potential ahead of them, and it got broken by Jim Crow. And you know, in many ways, the Reeveses, played by Shea Whigham and Jess as George and Rachel Reeves, symbolize the holding on to the old guard, and how Jim Crow and why Jim Crow came in to sort of hold Black people back from agency and progress.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the finale and that scene in particular, I do want to dig into that. Lauren, what was that like? I mean, now you are confronted by Rachel, right, in this finale, and those scenes. I want to talk about what that was like for you shooting those particular scenes and how it changed Jenny, essentially.
How it was shooting was hard. It was hard on the body. It was to allow, I mean, that's our job, to take our imagination and allow ourselves to endow certain things with either a spirit of goodness or a spirit of, you know, evil or whatever it is, and navigate throughout it and give your body over to that experience. Ooh, I'm breathing now, even recalling it, right? It's what I had to do in particular with Demi, who plays Sally. She became my baby, you know. She was, and thankfully we have also Clark Johnson, who played little Sally. So I had to endow this relationship of motherhood who for me, Lauren, I don't have the experience of motherhood, but I had to endow those 2 actors as being my babies, and I am the only thing in this world that can protect them. And then I had to go and experience that very necessary need to protect my house with the very thing that enslaved me in my house. And it was heartbreaking, frankly, to confront that demon inside that space that, you know, that I had made my own. It was also very necessary, and I was honored to be able to be in service of that story, because it is exactly the experience that I think, you know, from that time up until now, that a lot of people have had to endure, those kinds of humiliation moments, and also holding it together in front of the children that they are trying to set an example for. So when Jenny confronts Rachel and tells her, "Out, devil," now, I think it is an understanding, to David's point about the demonic nature of the psychosis of believing that you can possess another human being in this world.
Yeah.
That should have ownership over their body and their mind, their ideas, the things they create, all of those things. And I think there was an understanding in Jenny that came in the scene. Well, I'll say this. I had another scene that came before that scene that gave me an epiphany about Jenny Reeves herself and what she must have been thinking about how she saw the institution of slavery. And so later I was able to use that in that scene. And I think I think she could see the devil in the possession of the devil in that person. And that's kind of where that line came from, and that delivery and that understanding of you're not welcome here, because this is a home that has been prayed over. These are people that have been prayed over, that are protected. And again, it just goes back to what I was saying about Jenny Reeves herself. And what I learned about Jenny is that she is a protector, she is a provider, but she's also protected. And there was real consequence for Jenny if she would have to hit a white woman in that time. But she was protected. She was protected spiritually, and she was protected by the Black man she loved. So, you know what I mean? There's a certain kind of empowerment that comes with that. There's a certain kind of ownership and courage that comes with that. And to be able to see that on the page and say, oh, we're not only going to see a Black woman who is a protector, but she's also protected. She's not just a lover, but she's also loved.
Yeah.
Wow. You know what I mean? I just, that image being reinforced in this time, in this day, and being a Black woman myself, I'm like, yes, let's tell this story. Let's do it just like this.
David, I don't know what words you use to describe Bass, but when I think of him, I think of someone who is very skilled, very sharp, very smart, but also very quiet and controlled. And not quiet because he believes he has to be, but because he's thinking, right? But controlled in his manner until he is pushed, right? And we see that in episode 1, where George Reeves kind of pushes him out of his character. And we also see that with Mr. Sundown as he's like tracking him down in the finale. I want to know what words you just used to describe Bass, but then also what are the parallels you think, between these two characters and almost these bookends in these episodes, as we see his character, he's being brought to those, to that level. Why do you think that is?
Well, in my research about Bass Reeves, it was talked about endlessly that he was a man of few words, and I tend to associate that with wisdom. He was someone who did more listening than talking, and that manifested in his mode of law enforcement. I think people cannot fully appreciate how impossible it must have been to have a 32-year long career in law enforcement at that time in America, where you're not only coming out of enslavement into Reconstruction, but then going into Jim Crow. All of those periods are periods where, as a Black man who is empowered, there is a massive contingent of people, largely white and racist, who deem you having that position as completely unacceptable. And you are also empowered, in and amongst his over 3,000 arrests, a large percentage of that would be white people, white outlaws, a lot of them disenfranchised, disgruntled Confederate soldiers or people who are trying to hold on to the Confederacy, who are acting lawlessly in reaction to that and are completely confused by a Black man coming anywhere near them to arrest them. So in terms of these qualities he has, again, to Lauren's point, this was a man of faith, not in the perfunctory sense, in a very real sense. His moral compass was governed by his faith. He had a deep knowing that he also was protected, and he was called. He was called to something higher, which is why he could go out of enslavement, be deployed as a deputy U.S. Marshal, and find a way to reconcile being deployed by someone in the form of Judge Isaac Parker, who represents the kind of white male authoritarian, both optically and in reality, person that had enslaved him. the questions he must have had, am I being used? Am I a weapon for this system that has sought to break my people for centuries? Or am I an instrument of God to go in and redress some of the injustices in this society, in this community? To do that for as long as he did, to be a loving father, a loving husband, to be as skilled at what he did, you have to be someone who is great at observation. And even though he wasn't literate, there are accounts of he would go home, Jenny could read, she would read his writs back to him, and she only needed to read them once for him to memorize them. And he would have up to 30 writs, and he would memorize them all and be able to recite them after weeks on the road when he was arresting someone. So the levels of intelligence were massive. He could speak Choctaw and Creek and some other Native American languages, which is why he was so skilled at what he did. And so someone harboring that level of skill, someone who has historically been that marginalized and undervalued, and yet can continue to operate at a level of excellence that even people who are begrudging about it went, well, yikes, I'm going to give it to Bass Reeves. There were people who literally, if they knew he was in the vicinity, would turn themselves in, just because they knew Bass Reeves was in the area, if they knew they'd committed a crime. So playing someone like that, you almost have to operate on two levels, the literal and the supernatural, whereby he is just someone who the nature of his calling is really palpable.
Yeah. Well, we see him in the finale. Can you add on just, what that was like shooting that scene, and obviously what was it about Esau that brought that back out of him, this ferociousness, to say the least?
Well, yeah, I mean, what people who haven't studied Bass Reeves will also not necessarily know is this is a man who later in his life, we don't depict this in the show, but Jenny and Bass's son, when he's older, through a series of events, ends up killing his wife. And Bass goes out, brings his son in, and his son serves prison time for over 10 years for that crime. So that is the level of Bass's understanding of, and him feeling like he's called to be a champion for justice. Even his own son, Benny, has to be someone who adheres to the law. So in our show, what you see, these bookends you talk about very early on, a massive, I'm trying not to give too much away, but a massive injustice is committed by a character called Esau. And we see how Bass stews over that for the 8 episodes, and then finds out that this same character is doing something to Black men specifically that is unconscionable and is illustrative of what he had experienced, Bass had experienced during slavery times. So the combination of the personal crime that this character had committed against Bass, and the crime he's now committing against Bass's community, just means that there is something he needs to do that is even uncomfortable for him. Because one of the things that our show looks like is, what is justice? Is justice revenge? Is justice adhering to the laws that were also in place when slavery was legal? Which system are we fighting on the side of? Because the legal system at the time was corrupt. Slavery was unjust and terrible. We see Black people who, in a bid to own their freedom that was rightfully theirs, they had to do things that colored outside of the lines of what was deemed to be the law. Now, as a Black man, you're now going in to arrest someone who did something the likes of which you did in the first episode, to have your own freedom given to you. So this gray area is something that the show really explores and must have been head spinning for Black people at that time. And that's what you're looking for as an actor, is an extreme arc of transformation. How the complexity, the complicated nature of a marriage, of being a father, of being formerly enslaved and now empowered, this time, this place, all of it is in this show. And that was the massive, massive gift this was to Lauren and I.
Well, I can see your faces light up, both of you, as you talk about these characters. I want to thank you personally for embodying them, for bringing them to life so beautifully and sharing them with the world, so that we can get to know them a little better. I am so excited for what else may be in store with this particular series. But in the meantime, you can stream Lawmen Bass Reeves on Paramount Plus right now. And see episodes 1 through 8. If you have got Paramount Plus, if you don't, please make sure you get the app. But thank you again to our amazing panelists for joining us today for this conversation about this phenomenal show that is too great to miss. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jasmine.